you for joining us today for a discussion on recognizing and removing project bottlenecks. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Pluralsight. And we'll have this webinar lasting for roughly about 45 minutes, wherein I, with our panelists, will, after which we'll head over to the lead dev Slack channel to answer some of your questions in the engineering velocity channel. So let's get started with some introductions. I'm Smriti Patel. I lead the LEAP and the data platform engineering organizations at Stripe, and I'll be moderating our discussion for today. And with us on our panel are some lovely people with diverse backgrounds. So let's start it off with you, Said.
Hey, I'm Said Ketchman. I work for the New York Times. I'm a director of engineering there. I lead a group called Growth Platforms, and we support the subscription growth mission within the Times. So we have a lot of technology right in the center of how we grow our subscribers. So bottlenecks is something we have to prevent and help make sure that our projects are delivered smoothly.
That's great. Looking forward to hearing more. Sarah, let's start with you next.
Hey everyone, I'm Sarah Hicks, Vice President of Product at MailChimp. I'm responsible for all of our commerce initiatives and work closely with my teams, which include engineering, product design, and project management. Really looking forward to talking about bottlenecks as we're actively working on a massive project right now. So it'll be a good conversation. I got to MailChimp last year through an acquisition. I was previously the founder and CEO of Reaction Commerce, which was an open source commerce platform. So excited to be here.
Lovely. TJ.
Hey guys, TJ McNichols. I work with Pluralsight. I lead our Flow organization for EMEA. So Pluralsight Flow works collaboratively with software engineering leaders to implement metrics-driven programs, but really to work alongside engineering organizations to be able to identify impediments within our process, but then remove them and to unblock, kind of from a bottoms up approach of enabling engineers and engineering organizations to spend more time on the activities we care most about.
Lovely, thank you. And Victor, how about you?
Hi, Victor Veer here. I'm a senior software engineer at Credit Karma. I work on the personal loans team. I'm basically a tech lead for our backend team there. So we mainly build products around helping you find personal loans and tools to help you manage some of your other debt, like refinancing your credit card debt or consolidating some of your other debt.
I just used Credit Karma recently, Victor. So looking forward to hearing more.
Yeah.
A very warm welcome to all our panelists today. So let's get started. I like to define engineering velocity in terms of shipping software with precision. That's what are we shipping and why. Speed, which is how frequently are we able to ship. Quality, that is like what's your failure rate or quality of your software. And last but not the least, impact, about how does it truly achieve your business goals. So if you look at about engineering velocity holistically, speed is naturally a very, very big component of it. So let's get a little bit into why does speed or execution matter? Why is it important for us to develop that muscle? Victor, let's start with you.
Yeah. So, I think speed matters for, kind of like the business impact. And that's kind of a given that like you want to hit your deadlines. Like, we have goals for our project. I think of like, speed and execution also as like a function of like well-being of the team, like mental well-being and happiness of the team, right? Like the analogy I like to use is like, you're commuting to work or something, right? Like, the perfect commute is like you get in your car, you hit every green light on the way there and like, you end up at the parking lot, right? But, the reality is like you end up in like, hey, like you have to stop and go traffic, or you hit every red light there, or you accidentally get on the local train instead of the express train. And, it's not really even the time like to get to work that is really frustrating. It's all the stopping, right? It's like, you move 10 feet, stop, move 10 feet, stop. And so that starts to wear on you, right? And like, it happens, in certain projects where there are like, blockers and impediments and, there might be a car accident or something and, you have to live with that. But, if that happens on every single project where you're hitting every single red light or, you are always in like the stop and go traffic or stop and go pattern with your project, it becomes, a thing that really wears down your team and starts to affect the happiness of your team and it eventually leads to like, hey, like it actually kind of snowballs into you are working less effectively. So I think it's like, it's really important for us to emphasize and look at the execution velocity on a day-to-day basis, because, overall, like, over the long run, it's about the happiness of your team, and it will eventually affect the actual output of your team as well.
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot. The bit about how individual well-being ties to the team happiness. TJ, what are your thoughts on this about why execution matters?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes we kind of over leverage on speed, and it over time, go faster just kind of sounds like do more, and kind of unhelpful terms that we're used to. I think it's important to acknowledge that as companies grow, it becomes just more inherently difficult to simply write code and deploy product. So, as much as we reach a certain scale where we can't just throw more money or resources at a problem to continue to try to go faster. So yes, the old adage of, well, then we have to work smarter, but I think that's actually true. And I think it's important to then take a look at how we're organized, and how we operate cross-functionally, and then how we communicate as teams to continue to try to improve our process as opposed to just trying to add more to solve the problem.
Yeah, burning the midnight oil is not always the right solution for sure. For sure there. So, Sarah, how about you?
Oh gosh, what to add? I think what Victor and TJ have said, it really resonated with me as well. I think at our highest level, execution matters because it connects into our purpose, like as individuals and as teams. It's that well-being that Victor was talking about. Executing and delivering on our projects trigger kind of a sense of purpose, and well-being in us. It's in our nature, all of us, to create, right? And implementation and execution are kind of in my mind, the main components of the creative process, right? When we're executing, not only are we moving goals forward for a company, delivering value to customers, but we get these positive feedback loops, that Victor's talking about when we execute. So it's people build products, not the other way around. Products don't build people. And we as humans, we love feedback loops. So, it's one of those things that's just core to who we are and why it matters.
I love it, Sarah. I love the sense of how purpose ties to execution. Thank you for that. Saeed, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good points. I think something that Victor said that stands out to me a lot is having teams where the people on your team enjoy what they're doing, and removing bottlenecks. I mean, that's key. Like if you have a happy team, they're willing to do more. They want to stay, and so it kind of factors in like delivery. There's project road bottlenecks really impact both delivery, which hurts the company bottom line, but then you also hurt retention, and acquiring good talent on your teams, because who wants to work on a team that's just super slow or always gets blocked? So I think those are really two big areas. Another one is, I think is, to what TJ said, is as the company is growing, the technology, the programs that you have become more complex. And when you are constantly hitting bottlenecks, you find short-term workarounds to them. And so you're introducing bad practices into your processes, into your code. And eventually that tech debt or process debt is gonna catch up to you. And so it's really critical for a growing company that you think about this beforehand, because all those corners you cut, you're gonna have to pay that back. And I think lastly too, for individuals, the teams that can deliver quickly without causing a lot of damage in the process and have happy people as a result, those are the people that the organization is going to trust more with more important projects. So if you want to grow, if you want to work on like the good stuff, the big problems, the big opportunities, you gotta be able to handle these bottlenecks gracefully.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing you all say is execution is super crucial, whether it is at the individual motivation, happiness, well-being, whether it's at the team in terms of how holistic, how synergistic it is, and also in terms of the business value and organizational trust and credibility. So let's zoom out a bit and say, if you take the 3 phases of software development and break them down into the planning phase, the execution, where the meat of development is, and then the delivery, what are some, before we even get into execution, what are some of the things leading up to it in terms of, like, say, setting the stage, so to speak, that we want to be thinking about? So the next question here is like, how do we then set expectations, estimates, or deadlines with your stakeholders on such large, ambiguous projects? Sayed, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different techniques here, but I think one of them that we've tried at the times within some of the groups that I'm part of is establishing shared goals across the group. I'll give an example. We had about 3 teams that were ended up being 4 teams that were working together, had to work together on a regular basis for some initiatives that we're working on, but they weren't within the same group, and they weren't even, we have a mission structure at the times as well, and they weren't even in the same mission. So the goals of each of the teams were slightly different. So what we end up doing is saying, okay, well, our teams need to work together for a lot of the work in this year. This is last year. So let's come up with our own shared goals across the entire group that are not the mission goals, not the group goals, but our own as a group together. I think once we establish that, where it's like we're all aiming for the same sub goal here, each of the teams had the opportunity to come up with their goals too. Well, how does that, our overarching goal, fit in for your team for what you're being asked from your mission as well? So because we were being asked from a lot of different places. And then we shared that out. And I think just establishing that was super helpful because it was no longer all of us having different bosses and different reporting lines and trying to please those people and that conflicting with our project objectives. But now we had these aligned project objectives we all knew, and we shared that with all the team, the engineers, the design, everyone on the team. So I think setting that up from the beginning, aligning on shared goals, understanding that those goals are different per team as well, but understanding why this matters to the company. That was super, super helpful. And I do recommend experimenting with that with teams. Another thing too is it connects to this is relationship building. It's critical to build up relationships before you're asking people to do things for you. Whenever you get a cold call, someone saying, "Can you do this for me?" They're, that it's rare that someone will say, "I don't know you, but I'd love to do whatever you're asking me to do." So building those relationships can help you kind of cut through, like people will give you their ear if they know who you are, if they know what your intention is, if they know what your goals are. And if the company you work for doesn't have that culture, it's starting to build that culture of just, I'm not only going to talk to you when I need something, but I care about you. I care about what your own goals are and making sure that aligns. I think the last thing I'll say on this is talking early. A lot of times we come when we've already made a decision and we say, "Can you prioritize this work?" And then everyone rolls their eyes or says, "Well, I have 10 other things to prioritize. Okay, I'll look into it." And then it gets escalated. And then finally someone has to be told, "You have to do this." And that's too late. Another example we did related to this is we had one of our teams go out to stakeholders. It was a platform team. And we said, go out to the stakeholders and start talking to them because we don't have the culture yet of them coming to us early on. So we know that we are going to be a dependency for them and we may be a bottleneck for them. So let's go out, talk to them early on. So we set up these meetings very early to say, don't tell us what you've decided. We know you haven't decided because planning's not done. Tell us what you're thinking about. We won't hold that against you if these ideas aren't good. It's fine. And we'll work with you to figure out which idea is the best, like which one we can actually execute on easier and which one aligns with our goals. So all these things, I mean, it's a lot of early, before you need something, go ask, ask people, get to know people ahead of time, establish shared goals, all of that. If you already need the work done, it's really hard at that point because now you're just battling priorities across the organization.
I really like what you said about actively seeking out what others' roadmap looks like so that you have early indication into what that might be when they do come to your doorstep or vice versa. Thanks, Said. Victor, how about you? You've been a tech lead at different companies leading different projects. A big millstone sometimes tends to be tech debt. And sort of getting organizational or business buy-in for such shape projects tends to be super ambiguous or critical. Are there any experiences there that you'd like to share in terms of how you might have set the stage before the execution began?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe I'm like a cynical engineer, and I actually, the way I view it is like, tech or like code is just a means to an end, right? Like, I think, at Credit Karma, our goal is to like, help our customers make financial progress, right? And so if we could write zero code and like help them do that, that would be like my ideal world, right? And, we don't live in this ideal world. But in this, this kind of leads into like, tech debt is you can kind of relate to that, right? It doesn't live in isolation, right? And it goes back to what Sites is saying, which is like when these organizations start to grow, you start accumulating debt, and it starts to slow down your velocity, right? Most of my pitch around tech debt is not like, hey, like, we need to fix tech, this tech debt for, just in isolation because the code looks bad or ugly, right? Like there's plenty of ugly code in there that works and doesn't bother anyone. And like, we probably don't need to really address it. But a lot of the tech debt, does have an effect on the team, right? There is a velocity effect, right? You have this poorly written code that's not scaling, and now it's either, a development process issue where, hey, like, our engineers are working really slowly because, they're on this like ancient architecture or ancient framework. And we need to address this because, sure, we might be able to go build this feature and hit the deadline, but like, that, you slowly stretch that over a year, and we're actually, operating way slower than we should be, right? We could be building 20 features instead of like 10 features, right? And so I think velocity is a big way I pitch it. When we're talking about like, how do we address tech debt, right? And usually like, I tend to pitch it as part of something else, right? Like, hey, like we're already gonna go in here and, build this feature. Let's go ahead and address this, right? As long as it's a reasonable ask or a reasonable part of that project. The other way is, like reliability. It's just like, if you think about the back end of the project, right? You finish the project, you finish the features, everyone's celebrating. Oh, wait, now here are the bugs. They're rolling in, and now we're losing money, or we didn't account for something, or users are having a frustrating experience. And it's like, that part of it also matters around tech debt, right? It's like you have this unmaintainable code, everything's done, but not everything was quite right. And so, we need to go in and actually, hey, like, let's go and refactor this so that it is like a more reliable, understandable piece of code so that we don't have those issues on the back end, right? I'm pretty sure it's every engineer and product manager's nightmare to like continue to work on the same project, like, while you're working on a different project, because the other one never really ended. So I think those are two ways you can really pitch, like, how do we like address tech debt, or how do we find time to address tech debt, which is like, there's the velocity aspect, and there's kind of this reliability and like revenue aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I really like that a bit, especially around predictable execution. The big thing about tech debt is you're going to pay an ongoing price for it because it'll keep slowing you down in ways you can't see. And so getting ahead of it, or actually being intentional about saying, okay, we're going to take a month to sort of figure out all our bugs or library issues, actually enables you a long time velocity for short term, so to speak, reduction in speed. So Victor, thank you for that one. Sarah, how about you? Anything there that you want to add in terms of what are setting the stage kind of things look like, especially from product development and management?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of the key components here. I think kind of setting the stage does involve a lot of relationship building. It's that collaboration early on. I'm a big fan of, tightly aligned, loosely coupled. So how can we, give project teams, engineering, design, product, a problem to solve, and helping them to ask questions, collaborate early, rather than them feeling like, something's being handed to them that's already decided, like we talked about. So I think that's just such a critical component of setting the stage to, an early part of the project development lifecycle.
Thank you for that. Technically, I think abstractions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We might have some technical difficulty.
There you are, you're back. I'll start talking anyways. I think what Victor touched on is really, really important about, well, it's almost sometimes you have to fight the urge to fix, because we're under the hood and it's like, oh, well, I'm here, maybe I can start, and sometimes we become our own blocker. So, and kind of what Sarah said of, well, we have to do this tech debt, but we need to be smart about it, and we need to plan it, because right now it's not in this sprint, and we can't really go down that path because now we have the whole release, potentially being delayed. But then it's very difficult to manage that internally at businesses because, you know, it's now, you know, tech debt's become kind of a C-suite buzzword. Everyone loves it to, you know, throw that word out there. You know, how much time are we spending on paying down tech debt? But we don't really understand it as a business. And then kind of on the other side of the mouth, it's like, how much time are we spending paying down technical debt? But where's the new features and when are they going to ship? And so it almost seems counterintuitive to say, no, actually, we're going to take a month off and we're going to do 2 full sprints of tech debt. And no, at the end of this month, we're not going to have new features and new shiny things for sales to go and sell. But in the long term, we are going to ship faster and ship on time and ship with less bugs, the things that we ultimately care about, which I think is a really important conversation to have at a business. And is a difficult one to have, you know, especially with stakeholders who don't always truly understand what goes on in engineering.
Absolutely. So this is a good segue into projects which are under execution and perhaps blocked. How do we identify such bottlenecks, and what are some of the factors to consider, or maybe tools or metrics that we can leverage along the way? TJ.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of our customers, so that's kind of what Pluralsight Flow does, is, you know, provides this visibility and, you know, interconnectivity across the delivery cycle from ticket to kind of shipped in production and everything in between. So things that we look at is like active coding days. It seems pretty simple on the surface. It's just the average number of days that we spend active in the code base as teams. And it almost kind of sounds like the do more, go faster. But really what it's talking about is if you see that drop, it is actually an indicator of ENPS, or engineering happiness, right? Because what we love doing is building, creating, and collaborating. And that's when we're at our best and happiest. If we're not active in the code base, where are we spending our time? Is it meetings? You know, are we waiting on others? There's no such thing as an idle engineer. So if productivity by however measurement is decreasing, that just means that for some reason we're not getting specs, or we're demotivated, or we're physically blocked from doing the things we care about most. A couple other things: PR cycle time, right? Long running pull requests, things that seem to just drag on for days. Really important in the new remote world that we find ourselves in. You know, because typically we'd just go and jump in an office and whiteboard it, or we'd turn around and say, hey, what's going on with this one? We can't do that anymore. So obviously there's the business side of it, of how do we ensure that we're meeting deadlines and moving projects forward, but also, you know, supporting all of our teams and our engineers who sometimes are kind of getting lost in the, you know, in the shuffle at large orgs. And then lastly, I would talk about, you know, probably look at knowledge distribution. You know, another metric that you can actually see of where individuals are sharing knowledge, how widely distributed it is within an organization, where knowledge silos exist. And sometimes what we find is that with many of our customers, they find really that some of their most tenure engineers, their most brilliant minds, are sometimes the ones that are in these knowledge silos. You know, they get the most difficult tickets and they're kind of just heads down at their desk, working really hard, solving really beautiful problems. Well, that's wonderful, but what that does is prevent them from more broadly interacting with the team, and vice versa, right? Nobody can review your code. You're the only person who knows that code, that area of the code base. So kind of, you know, setting that expectation with one-on-one and reassuring with individuals, you are one of our most tenured and smartest and brightest. I want that to continue to make its way out there, not only for personal development and growth for that person, but obviously, you know, for the benefit of that person's peers and the team and the code base as a whole, which is really important.
TJ, I can
really
jump
like
in.
the idea of succession planning, mentoring, as you're talking about. Sorry, Sarah, go on.
Oh, I can go ahead and jump in on some of what TJ was talking about there. You know, I think identifying project bottlenecks is really what we do as managers and leaders, right? And I found that one of the keys for kind of identifying project bottlenecks is really to listen. It sounds deceptively simple, but I think we've all been in one-on-ones or in meetings where, folks just aren't listening to each other. I've been in small startups as well as now larger organizations, and I really use my one-on-ones to suss out if someone or something is blocked. I start every one-on-one with a simple kind of personal check-in. I'll often use a stoplight check-in, kind of, green, yellow, red. How are you feeling? What's your confidence level on this project? Or I'll use a temperature check or a pulse check, something like on a scale of 1 to 10. How would you, rate things right now? How would you kind of your team's health right now? And you kind of quickly hear and you quickly identify themes, and you start to develop a pretty good barometer across your team. You'll start to hear words folks are feeling frustrated, or they'll say they're blocked or they're annoyed. And those are kind of like words that I pay attention to, because then I know that I've got some work to do to either connect people together, to provide clarity where maybe there's some confusion. And I also regularly will ask folks in the midst of projects, hey, what should we start? What should we stop? And what should we continue doing? Just that simple framework: start, stop, continue. And that will also, surface a few good gems, kind of that indicate that there are bottlenecks and improvements to make. And I think the last thing to point out is bottlenecks are to be expected. Like, I think it's good to normalize that this is going to happen, and then we're here to remove them. We're human, and not that they're these taboo things that bottlenecks shouldn't happen. Bottlenecks are kind of the norm in large projects, and working with large groups of people across different teams, as Victor was talking about.
I think that's probably the only bit I'd add to that is, the kind of unknown unknowns, expect the unknowns. And you should pretty much, and sometimes that means, like, I don't know, keeping some extra time in a sprint for the emergency, or when things starts breaking and it's a fire drill, or maybe just know that scope creep, while we hate it, is sometimes inevitable. And I think it's also important to have empathy. Everybody is really trying to do their best right now, and even if sometimes that you're not being treated with that same empathy by that person who's trying to jam something into your sprint, they're probably doing it because they're under a tremendous amount of pressure themselves. So I think the more, again, that we foster and collaborate and communicate that sort of culture, but then also just be upfront with ourselves that it's going to happen. Let's stay ahead of it and treat it calmly when it does come.
Yes, Said. Go on. What would you like to add there?
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I really like what Sarah, what you had said, and TJ as well. But specifically around like leadership's role with bottlenecks, it's sometimes we just want to, like, why is your project not going well? You're not doing a good job, right? You're saying this to a manager or something like that. And sometimes they do need support. Sometimes things do need to get escalated. And I think we shouldn't, as whatever level you're at, everyone has a certain level of leadership. Making sure that we are supporting the teams properly, not just blaming them for having some trouble. I think too, like, because if you're in the middle of it, like, okay, it's nice at the beginning you can plan everything right, but say you're stuck in the middle of a project, you inherited a project. Sometimes it is pausing on the project for a minute and reassessing where you're at. Like, let's just all pause for a minute. Let's reevaluate where we're at. We made a lot of assumptions at the beginning. Let's check those assumptions, make sure they're still valid, and then reset everything. And a part of that too is you may have to change deadlines or expectations. And if you can do that, if you can pause and communicate that properly and communicate it across to all stakeholders, a lot of times the bottlenecks will happen, but having a bad outcome from them is not necessary. And it's about resetting expectations. And you may find that when you're only halfway through the project, if you just say, I need another month or another 2 months on this project because of XYZ reasons, and this is a safer way to launch this, it may be okay. But if you're in the final stretch, the last 10%, and you come and say the same thing, it may not be okay at that point. So I think it's when you think you're getting towards a bottleneck, you pause, you kind of reassess your assumptions, you escalate what you need to your boss, make sure there's a lot of visibility there. And most times, it will still be successful at the end for the team.
So I really like that bit about being intentional about the trade-offs you're making and then escalating at the right times, because you want to, if it is bad news, the sooner given, the better it is for everybody involved. Doing it with empathy and doing it early and often to revisit some of the deadlines or even cost in terms of people or time becomes super critical. So thank you for that. Actually, that's a good segue to taking a step back and saying, if you adopt a system of systems view, how can organizational culture help or hurt project delivery? And what are some of the pitfalls there that we want to avoid, or consequently, best practices that we might want to nurture? Victor, let's start with you for this one.
Yeah. So, I view like, in terms of like, how do you help like a project run smoothly in terms of that culture? I like to talk a lot about like kind of like an unblocking culture, and like getting buy-in from not only like the leaders, right? Like I think, as leaders, you're like, hey, like let's, Sarah's saying like we need to go check in and see what the blockers are, and we need to have empathy. As almost everyone has been mentioning here, but it really starts like right at the bottom of your organization, right? In terms of like, hey, like everyone needs to have empathy and understand each other's blockers, right? Because it's, sometimes there are like big blockers where like, hey, like we've actually run into a problem and we can't execute on this product requirement. But usually it's like the small things of like, hey, like, code reviews aren't getting done fast enough, right? Or I need someone else to look at this code, or I need someone else to help me like understand this piece of technology that I'm now working with. Those are like kind of the general day-to-day things that end up, kind of slowing down an entire project, right? So, you really have to kind of like preach this to everyone. It's like, hey, like, the important thing really isn't yourself. It's like, what someone else is stuck on, right? If someone needs a code review or someone needs, help understanding something, like you should go in there and stop what you're doing. And obviously don't like, drop everything right then and there, but like, within a reasonable amount of time, like, hey, drop what you're doing and go and help them and unblock them. Because, what you don't want is like, members of your team, like twiddling their thumbs, right? And, if you take this to a larger scale, it's not just like engineers, it could be like, hey, like we don't have designs to actually go build this UI, right? Like we need to like focus on like, what is actually blocking us, right? Like if you're, already like, 2 or 3 steps ahead and like, designing the marketing stuff when the UI itself is not, ready, then like, hey, like that's, that's going to be problematic for execution as a team. So I think it comes, down to like, hey, how do we preach a culture where, we're all kind of being empathetic and mindful of like, what others need, right? And so start that early. Start that with, your junior engineers, your junior designers, get them thinking about like, hey, how can I help the rest of the team execute? And that slowly starts to bubble up to the rest of the organization.
Yes, and especially coupling that as engineering leaders, right? Are we creating that environment of psychological safety for folks to raise their hands and say, hey, I need some support, or whether it is in terms of education, in terms of skill set, in terms of some learning material, or even in terms of sometimes, a spin-up buddy or a mentor who can support them through, and creating that culture where folks feel comfortable and safe enough to approach you and say, hey, I need help, also goes a long way. Is something I've found super useful. Sarah, how about you? If we take an organizational leader viewpoint, how do you think about balancing autonomy for team members with also smooth delivery of projects?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, sometimes this can be pretty tricky, right? I mean, I said this earlier, but I strive to get to a place where the teams I'm managing and leading are, I use the phrase kind of tightly aligned, loosely coupled. So in my world, this means kind of engineering, design, product teams, they're all working closely together. They're aligned on our objectives and the goals, but there's room to collaborate. There's time for discovery early on in that life cycle, like we talked about at the start. But it's, we all know sometimes it's a pendulum. There are recent times and in a project that we're working on right now where we got it all kind of switched up, where we were loosely aligned and tightly coupled. And it definitely felt out of whack. I was starting to hear grumblings in all of my one-on-ones from the team that they were feeling like there was like too much top-down management. We've all heard this, one of my favorite things is when you start to hear that product's telling me what to do. And so, I always wanted teams to feel like they have agency. to act and to create in accordance with the objectives and the timelines that we've got. And the best way and kind of the simplest way I found to balance this autonomy is to be super repetitive. So like I just, my job is repeating the vision, the goals, the objectives, making sure managers, leaders, all as clear as possible, and then getting the teams aligned to collaborate and to define the work, not for us to define it for them. So it's like give room for that discovery and that collaboration, because that's where the magic happens. That's where folks really get, that when they have that autonomy and that agency, you really start to see velocity increasing, I think, as well.
I love it. TJ, what would you like to add there?
I mean, there's not much to add. I mean, everyone's nailing it here. I mean, but like what Saeed said though too is like, and Victor, to a point of, if you know something is, and look, let's be honest, we know when things are going to go wrong. We know when even if a release is 5 or 10 days out, we kind of know now something's brewing. You need to have that culture fostered to enable people to raise their hand and start that difficult conversation. And ultimately it lends itself to credibility. If you say now, hey, I think we're going to miss this deadline, whatever it may be, right? That lends a heck of a lot more credibility to, I know what's going on and we're really in charge here. And as opposed to the day of or the day after being like, sorry, we missed it. Well, when did you know? Why? Could have we done something? Did you need help? Are we, right? So, but in order to do that, we need to empower teams and leaders to be able to start that conversation.
Yeah, and in terms of empowering, creating autonomy and agency, one thing that I've found very useful is having very explicit roles and even norms about how teams might collaborate and communicate with each other. Roles, especially because quite recently I worked on a project where we had like these 2 senior engineers, and both were sort of, Stripe is a very kind culture, so both were sort of waiting for the other to make some decisions. And after a week or so, I was like, hey, who's really responsible, who's accountable? So we ended up doing a Venn diagram of responsibilities between 3 of us. And it was interesting and quite illuminating to see that we each made some assumptions about it. And so as we sat there together and said, okay, person X is responsible for this and person Y is sort of just going to be consulted, the RASI framework that Lara Hogan talks about was very useful, at least in terms of setting some of those expectations and then empowering each to go forth and make decisions and sort of then escalate in case, some decisions couldn't be made. Saeed, tell us a little bit more about how you think about creating that organizational culture at your level, especially as you also interact with a lot of different functions outside engineering.
Yeah, so this one's interesting for us at the Times because culture is really important for the Times. I mean, having a good culture and having people happy at what they do. One of the things what we realize is knowledge sharing, a culture of knowledge sharing, of people being able to have access to information is really, really important to eliminating bottlenecks, or trying to at least, or just having smoother projects and smoother planning. So, the 2 components of that is you need ways for people to be able to understand what's going on. So whether that's you documenting things, whether you're doing knowledge sharing, but it has to be part of the culture. And that's really hard to establish for any team, for any company. It's not like we don't have a perfect, we're always working on making it better. And most places probably don't have that perfect yet. But that's a big part of it. It's like, I know where to get information. I'm going to be leading a new project and working on something. How do I know? How do I even know who to talk to, or what information or what systems I need to involve in this? But a second aspect of that, because you can have all the information sitting there, you can have amazing wikis, you can have amazing documentation, but you have to have people who are curious and really set the expectations that they should understand all the adjacent systems, and they should understand everything that's going into the program the program or project that they're leading. So, example, like what I like to do is with engineers and managers too, is tell them, you're responsible for knowing not just your systems, but know everything that touches your systems. and you should know them as well as the other team. And maybe that is a high expectation to set. It's like, well, if you have good teams, you shouldn't have to have your team know so much. But I found that helps out a lot because they can speak the same language. There's a culture of not just throwing things over the fence, but actually saying, your team really understands and can empathize with the other teams. So that's been that. I think that's a huge cultural shift that we've been trying to do, and I think can really help with removing bottlenecks.
Thank you. TJ and you both talked about knowledge sharing and not having silos. I'm curious to see, are there any metrics or anti-patterns that you recommend folks from avoiding, or even holding people accountable in terms of how do you foster or sort of reward? Because culture is, all the behaviors. Culture is what you reward or punish, so to speak. And so in that, how do you drive accountability and what have you found useful there? TJ?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, we come from we Pluralsight come from a place of having data and visibility, so our flow product actually has very specific metrics that measure the amount of knowledge distribution that's occurring within a team, but then also across teams, of either very successful inner sourcing models, or it's exactly what Saeed said of, how do we collaborate with other teams, and even at the point of just, reviewing each other's code, even though it's very different, but it's interconnected, and that's okay because we know that about each other, and having those agreements in place, you can actually see that. Also you mentioned anti-patterns. There's the overhelper, the oversharer, somebody who loves to focus a lot of time talking about other people's work as opposed to their own, or even doing their own, and it's very easy to get caught in that pattern, but then just redirect it. Maybe that means that someone just has a lot of extra time on their hands, and maybe next time gets an extra, ticket or two in the sprint, or, but that eagerness and want to help and share it's on the leader to then redirect that towards, good. And I think you can easily identify that and turn a negative very quickly into a positive.
Victor, anything there that you found useful as a senior engineer leading other engineers through?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much guilty of the knowledge silo, and which I think everyone is guilty of somewhat, right? You kind of just get caught up in your own work, or hey, like this project's done, and like we're not going to talk about it again, or there is no reason to iterate on it, and so you end up with these silos. And I completely agree with Saeed and TJ here about, hey, like knowledge silos, are definitely problematic. I am also curious about, a good solution to this, because, I see, I don't really see the anti-pattern of like, overshares, because, you definitely see like, hey, here's a platform team, and, they built this awesome thing, and they hold a bunch of lunch and learns, and you're almost annoyed about how many emails are in your inbox. And then like, 3 weeks later, you're like, oh, wait, how do I do this again? I think the oversharing is actually a good thing. And maybe it's not like, hey, like, let's, set up like a whole bunch of sessions, right after something is released. It's like the consistent, like, hey, we're continuing to share this knowledge. And, one thing like even my manager has done is like, hey, like anyone who joins the team, like, basically gets to sit down with every engineer and learn about each part of the system. And then they come up with their own presentation and represent that presentation of like, hey, here are like, 4 different services that our team owns. And that presentation ends up being like the guideline for until like the next person joins the team. And so I think it's just like, this process where obviously like, hey, you've not shared the knowledge across the team, but that slowly starts to diminish, those resources as like, the services change, and, the team might be caught up, but as soon as someone else joins or wants to work on your project, all that information starts to become outdated. So I think it's just an iterative process where, hey, like, you need to set some like, for, actual time limit of like, hey, every couple of months we need to go update these docs, or you need to go like, present on these services again and get the state of the world and actually, you know, have these like, you know, hard deliverables of like either documents or you know, slides that actually, you know, tell you the entire story. So, you know, I don't think I have the secret sauce here, but I think there's, you know, a couple of things you can do to get that knowledge out over time.
I'll just add just one thing. I think sometimes too, we kind of go to the usual suspects, and it's not necessarily oversharing, but it is an anti-pattern of kind of, and we wrote a book about it. It's, you know, it's called 20 patterns to identify your software teams, and it's not all negative. It's really positive. It's that kind of heroing where somebody's putting everything onto their back, and it's awesome because we need those heroes, you know, to get through it. But when we start to rely and depend on those people, it's not sustainable. And what we've noticed is a lot in moving to remote, the sudden, you know, move to remote working, is that we just kind of have those reliable go-tos. And of course, like that creates the bus factor and everything like that. And it's not fair to those individuals over time and the imbalance, workload imbalance, sure. But also what you sometimes end up getting is too much influence. Those individuals have too much influence on the code base long term. You know, if they're the ones approving every single PR or responsible for commenting on every single PR, what you end up doing is actually putting all of your code through that filter, and that filter is an individual, right? And long term now, that person has too much of a mark on the code base, which is a risk as well. So it's about like understanding the why behind spreading this work out. You know, is always really important.
Thank you, teacher. Definitely will check the book out. And it's a great note to end our discussion today on the why. I loved a lot of topics that we covered today, both from why execution matters in terms of whether it's at the individual motivation and the well-being, or whether it's the team performance and a holistic synergy of teams in terms of communication, collaboration, and also in terms of building trust and credibility. And some of the things which we along the way want to set the stage of through having a vision, a North Star, and even early alignment and buy-in. So thank you very much for all the good insights from our panel today. We'll be taking questions until 10 for about on the Lead Dev Slack channel. That's Engineering Velocity. So let's head there to continue some of this discussion. Thanks again for joining everyone, and see you sometime next time. Thanks again to our lovely panelists today.